what's the use of two strong legs if you only run away? And what use is the finest voice when you've nothing good to say? What good is strength and muscle if you only push and shove? And what's the use of two good ears when you can't hear those you love? It's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got. Yeah, it's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got.
Welcome back to the Seeds of Revolution. We are very happy to have another one of Camus's microgrants recipients with us for this episode. We have our friends here from Solidarity Sundays to talk to us about their project and how they are seeking to help the people of the Okanagan and Lower Mainland. So before we get started, I think Oak, one of the members of Solidarity Sundays, I'd like to turn it over to you for a land acknowledgement.
Thank you so much, Joel. We from Solidarity are calling in from the unceded traditional ancestral land of the Syilx people, and our host is calling from the unceded traditional ancestral land of the Lekwungen people. These lands were and are invaded by imperial violence, occupied by people supporting extractive colonial ways of life. May our efforts unroot these oppressive systems and move to honor Syilx people, Lekwungen people, and all beings of these lands, these waters, this sky. May we feel and find our places among them, together in growth, bloom, stasis, and decay. We hold in our hearts peoples targeted with genocidal violence. Syilx people, Lekwungen people, Wet'suwet'en people, and all indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. Palestini people, Armenian people, Yemeni people, Congolese people, Sudanese people, and the many, many more peoples facing colonization and eugenics throughout the world. May we work together to spread freedom from harm through all lands. May the joys of life and well-being embrace our whole world.
Thank you very much, Oak. And joining us also from Solidarity Sundays, we have Mo, Sasha, and Neiman. So if y'all could just give us a general overview, what is Solidarity Sundays? What is your mission? What are you trying to accomplish?
Well, we are a mutual aid collective. We do a few things, but one of the main actions we do is weekly food distribution to our unhoused neighbors in downtown Kelowna, the city that we're in. But we also do a lot of mutual aid within our group and generally are just like working to make the world a more supportive, kind place where we are.
How did you all get started? How did you come together as a group, as a collective?
Yeah, so kind of goes back 2.5 years or so. There were a few friends, myself included, who decided that we wanted to start a study group. And this sort of came out of being loosely interested in leftist and anarchist theory and politics. A couple of us had been familiar with Murray Bookchin, who has this beautiful short little video on YouTube where he talks about the study group and how it's sort of like the beginning of a lot of social movements begin with just a few folks sitting in a room together reading radical texts. So we were like, okay, kind of like didn't quite know where to go. We decided to host a study group, and we began with, just studying sort of like systematically through leftist sociopolitical texts, drawing from Marxist stuff, anarchist stuff, feminist stuff, etc. Yeah, and we were doing that for a good 10 months or so. At this point, there was anywhere from 2 to like maybe 8 of us showing up to this study group. It was hosted on various nights of the week. And then we would always begin study groups by one of us would bring a quote and we would talk about it for 10 or 20 minutes before we dive into the text proper. And the quote it was some mid-November 2022, so 10 months into the study group, there was this beautiful quote, which I can read out loud right now, found in the classic pamphlet by Enrico Malatesta called Anarchy, where, about halfway through, he's talking about how, one of the primary drivers of human development is this law of solidarity. And then to develop this concept, he quotes Mikhail Bakunin, another classic anarchist, a couple paragraphs worth. I can read it out here because it was literally this quote that then spurred on us talking about, how can we act in solidarity with folks in Kelowna? And then the following week, we went on to just make some meals. So no one can recognize one's own human worth, nor in consequence realize one's full development if one does not recognize the worth of one's fellows, and in cooperation with them, realize one's own development through them. No one can emancipate oneself unless at the same time one emancipates those around them. My freedom is the freedom of all, for I am not really free not only in thought, but in deed, if my freedom and my right do not find their confirmation and sanction in the liberty and right of all persons, my equals. It matters much to me what all others are, for however independent I may seem, or may believe myself to be, by virtue of my social position, whether as Pope, Tsar, Emperor, or Prime Minister, I am all the while the product of those who are the least among us. If these are ignorant, miserable, or enslaved, my existence is limited by their ignorance, misery, or slavery. I, though an intelligent and enlightened person, am made ignorant by their ignorance, though brave and am enslaved by their slavery, though rich, tremble before their poverty, though privileged, grow pale at the thought of possible justice for them. Yeah, so that was taken from that pamphlet. And we ended up not even getting into the text proper in that group. I think there were 4 of us, and we just brainstormed the whole group of how can we actually do something? Because we've just been sitting in this room for 10 months studying or whatever. Yeah, one thing led to the next. We were just brainstorming how we can act in solidarity with marginalized folks, because we understood this concept of solidarity, meaning that, our individual freedom is inherently tied up with the least among us, or, those who are most marginalized by the systems in place. Yeah. And then I think it was 8 days later, we made 40 chili meals and went and distributed them downtown Kelowna, the 4 of us. And since then, it's been, about a year and a half or so, almost 2 years. It'll be 2 years this November. We've been doing it every Sunday since. I think we've only missed 1 or 2 Sundays.
That's fantastic. How did you all settle on making meals as the most immediate expression of solidarity? Because there were a million different ways, both political and, I guess a little bit less political, that we could choose to express our desire to act in solidarity with, the oppressed or the less fortunate. Making meals is fantastic. I'm curious why you settled on that particular tactic.
I think it was just this understanding of people need to have their basic needs met first before we can move into something different. And in in so-called Kelowna, where we're based out of, there's, this ongoing so-called housing crisis, and folks living outside and folks who are, only able to access if one meal per day, folks are going hungry, and it's one of those basic things that people need. That in sort of tandem with the fact that so many of us from this study group at the time are also struggling to put food on the table. So sort of recognizing that, the system that makes it really difficult for me to pay my rent and to buy nutritious food is the identical system that's causing people outside to not be able to feed themselves. So I think it was just this recognition of, there's these fundamental human needs people have, sort of thinking Maslow's hierarchy of needs or something, you need just physiological needs met first. And it was tangible. We had access to a kitchen, something we knew we could do, and we just knew we needed to start somewhere. because then, you start somewhere and things grow in every which direction. And it's a beautiful thing. And yeah, if we didn't start somewhere, there'd still be 6 of us meeting in a room weekly and not, there's 60, 70, 80 folks who are like at least peripherally involved with the collective now.
That's fantastic. We were talking a little bit before we started the recording about some of your group's organizational principles, some of the ideals that Solidarity Sunday seeks to emulate or uphold. Could you speak a little bit about that?
So we use consensus. So we have a collective decision-making process. Basically, at the start of every meeting, we talk about consensus and have our meetings. Everyone's able to talk, and we try to operate in like a non-hierarchical fashion. No one's in charge. People have different roles, but they're not like higher than any other. And like I would describe some of what we do as like anti-essentialist or anti-bio-essentialist, where we're not really buying into the idea that certain people are born into certain natural like systems. It's socially constructed. So I think that kind of works into what we do.
Great. Have you seen any, or experienced, I guess, more than seen, any pushback from the quote unquote authorities in Kelowna? I come from the United States, where Food Not Bombs activists are regularly ticketed, harassed, and arrested for making meals for unhoused people. I'm curious what you all have experienced from the powers that be when you try to express your vision of solidarity and community care.
There definitely has been pushback. I don't think to the extent that Food Not Bombs typically faces in the States. But for example, I think maybe 6 to 8 months ago, we started expanding into not just doing food distribution, but also having some clothing distribution. And so the food, we go along through the tent city and move and visit people tent by tent. Whereas clothing, we set up our own tent with tables where people could come and have it be like going to a store where you get to look through things and choose things of your own initiative, have them all nicely laid out. And bylaw did not like us setting up tents in Tent City. That is apparently against the use of space. So there's been finicky stuff like that, as well as just like, I know there's been a few times where members have been confronted mid-distribution. Yeah, it's an interesting balance. We've definitely had some resistance, but not as much as we expected at some points.
Well, that's great. That's much better than I think other organizations have experienced in similar places.
I can add a fun little tidbit. I know the first time we were addressed by bylaw, I think they said that the 2 reasons we weren't allowed there apparently was 1, fire safety, which is what they like to throw at every encampment, probably across Turtle Island. They definitely like share notes and stuff, but also it was that if we do this, other people are going to start doing it too. So basically, if people are giving away free food and free clothes, oh my goodness, everybody's going to start doing this. It's going to start cutting into profit margins, et cetera, et cetera. So
is that something that they said to you in person?
Yeah, those were the 2 reasons that the sort of like city/bylaw officials cited as why we're not allowed there. And then they told us to go work for existing nonprofits, which were explicitly a mutual aid collective because we aren't wanting to be a charity.
Can you talk a little bit about that, the difference between your vision of a community care collective and an established, recognized charity?
I think this is something I think about a lot through this collective and other mutual aid collectives I've been a part of. And a really big difference is that charity functions on the hierarchy. It inherently goes, well, we're people who have more, so we're going to give to people who have less. And built into that is the deciding who is worthy, who counts enough, and how much and what kind of help they should receive, usually without any actual consultation for the people that they're supposedly trying to help. Whereas mutual aid really shifts to that non-hierarchical, horizontal aspect where, as human beings, we all need help to live. All of us need assistance from other people of one kind or another. And also, all of us have something to give. And, sometimes people push back on that, but it's not just money, it's not just food, it's not just, physical strength. People who are there for people emotionally. That's a huge form of mutual aid. People who are able to just like be present while someone is having a rough time. And like there's endless skills that humans have. And we all need that from other people. So yeah, it's very, very much highlighting that it's not that, oh, we're better off and we're helping people who are lesser. In fact, in our collective, there's a lot of underscoring of actually through this time, a number of our members have themselves become unhoused one way or another because of how fragile the current system is and by design. So just being like, this isn't like us helping them. This is us making connections for all of us to be helped.
That's interesting, Oak. You were talking about a part of mutual aid can be emotional assistance. And I think in my own experience, that is really, really true. And sometimes as or even more valuable than lending somebody food and making them a meal is lending somebody your emotional support and commitment. I was wondering if any of you wanted to talk a little bit more about that, because I find that a really important part of mutual aid and one that's maybe less discussed than mutual aid that involves, food or clothing or some other tangible item.
I'm sure other folks have additional things to add, but one thing that immediately comes to mind for me is the amount of members of our collective who say that like the only reason they're still in this hellhole called Kelowna is because of our mutual aid collective. And it's not necessarily because we're having all of our, food needs taken care of by the collective. Like we do, when we make burritos, we eat them too in mutual aid fashion. But I think it's like the community that's like truly the reason why, like it's maybe everyone, I don't want to speak for everyone, but it's like so many folks are like, the only reason I'm still here is because of this thing. Or like, once I figured out this existed, what's kept me here and kind of what's kept me, kept me well.
That's interesting. Mo or Neiman, how do you feel about what Sasha and Oak were saying about the emotional part of mutual aid?
No, I agree. I'm definitely one of those people who have said to Sasha before, like, I don't know how I've lived here so long, like it just doesn't, I haven't felt a community in my life really like this, where it's like this really deep underlying like agreement on many important things that impact our lives. And just even the recognizing, the seeing of all the issues in so-called Kelowna, all the issues in Cross Turtle Island and other colonized places, just having that recognition, having people be like, yeah, I know, I've seen it too. Like, I understand it. I want to know more. I want to know how to stop it and, decolonize ourselves as much as we can. And yeah, it's kind of invaluable.
What do you all think it is? Because I agree with you 100% about the sense of community and the emotional support you get from being in a mutual aid collective. I get the same thing from being a part of Chemis. What do you think it is about, and I guess part of the answer lies in the question, what is it about 21st century capitalism in Canada that just struggles and fails to provide what you're talking about to the people who live here?
Well, I mean, like inherently, capitalism is a system that runs off of alienation and isolation. It makes you feel bad about yourself. It makes you feel bad about others. And of course, it's not just like, ooh, capitalism. It's like the people who are invested in keeping this hierarchy running. If you think poorly about other people, you're less likely to help them. If you think that everyone around you hates you, then you're less likely to reach out and be present. And so it's like there's some stuff that's, I'm sure, unique to Canada, but I feel like in a lot of ways it's a worldwide issue that people don't have community in a lot of the ways that used to be very common, even under past hierarchical systems. And I feel like Canada, especially with like the emphasis on politeness and like the appearance of being kind rather than the actual kindness, really, really makes anyone who is marginalized, and especially people who are multiply marginalized, feel like there's no one there for them, feel like nobody understands. And just on like a neurobiological level, that literally poisons us. Like cortisol, the stress hormone, is fantastic if you are in very, very short periods of activation. But when you are living your life constantly being bathed in stress, it is a poison that like fundamentally harms the body. So just to like be around people who go, no, you make sense. Like the way you are understanding this, like other people understand that too, is very calming to our nervous systems and lets us get out of that hyper stressed state and go, oh, actually, I can belong and things can be some kind of okay.
That's a great point. I can't even imagine what you were saying about those cortisol levels and the effects of stress. I've never been unhoused. I can't imagine what those effects are on somebody whose stress is an everyday occurrence when it comes to the most basic parts of life we take for granted, like where you're going to lie down at night and where you're going to get your next meal. I'm sure that's something that you all have seen working with your community and working on the project of mutual aid. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about how the people you help and the people that are in your community, you know, how they respond and how, I guess, you just observe them treating you and engaging in this mutual aid project? Like, what does that do for them? Not just filling their bellies, but what does that do for their emotional condition?
A couple things come to mind. One is like, yeah, so we have a tent city in Kelowna, 150 or more folks there, and Bylaw does these. At least they do these seasonal massive sweeps, or cleans is what they call them. Where, you know, they come in with a dump truck and a bunch of machinery, sometimes, you know, 20 or more RCMP officers, countless Bylaw, and there'll be, you know, leaders from different nonprofits around town. And it's like truly a traumatizing experience for people. People are having a lot of their belongings just thrown away because Bylaw just deems them as that they don't need it, even though it's these people's stuff and it's, you know, the only stuff that they have a lot of the time because they're in the position of being unhoused. We've done a couple times where we've made sure to be there on these days of the sweeps with, you know, a pop-up tent and with some basic snacks and refreshments and trying to be on site, because they know us. We've been doing this for almost 2 years. They know us as, you know, the burrito people who come on Sundays or um and yeah, I think that like there's definitely a qualitative difference from how I've interacted with folks, and I'm also pretty aware of like the nonprofit world also, and just how people view us as maybe like more safe people, as people who are independent from sort of like the nonprofit industrial complex. You know, you have a lot of like people from these charities are there to like quote unquote help, but they're also in collaboration with the oppressors, the Bylaw, the RCMP, the people who are throwing away these people's belongings, and like us being there on site or whether it's emotional support or just to be that person, those people who are there to watch and sort of liaison and keep Bylon, our CMP accountable. Yeah, I guess just to, I would underline the fact that I think folks do perhaps have more trust and more, think maybe differently of us because we're just like a group of friends, or we're a mutual aid collective. We're just a bunch of people who are out there to help. And this isn't my career. I'm not reporting back to somebody other than just these same friends who are here. Yeah, I hope that kind of answers it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Oak?
Yeah, and this was a thought I had a bit earlier, and it's also applicable here. I know as much as we focus a lot on food and being like, okay, this is a basic need that we can help at least a bit with, time and time and time again, what we have heard from people is that, like, yeah, the food's nice, but like you actually talk to me as a person and you give me the time. And again, like I've heard so many times people sharing that like the biggest struggle for them being unhoused is just not being treated as a person, either being completely ignored or being like used as a punching bag. Like there are a lot of people who do horrific things like driving by tent city or like being outright physically violent because they're like, well, these people don't matter. And like it across a lot of places, unhoused people are unpeopled, just not considered to be people. So the fact that we are there and, you know, like a lot of members of our collective will know people's names, will like have some semblance of like, oh, like this person like had this injury, how's that going? And that sense of connection, I know a lot of them have expressed that that is just as or even more meaningful than the food and the clothing.
So, Neiman, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the unique challenges you all face by organizing in Kelowna, whether they're challenges from, radical opposition groups, challenges because I know many of you identify as LGBTQ plus. Could you talk a little bit about what organizing in Kelowna looks like on a day-to-day practical level?
Yeah, like for those who aren't really from here or are familiar with the Okanagan, like it's a very reactionary place, very conservative place. And I think a lot of like organizing, and for me especially, it's a lot of like part of mutual aid is for me, anyways, is like safety, community safety, and stuff like that. And a lot of our people, like you said, are like queer people or like racialized people, and a lot of groups of people like in our own community might be targeted by a lot of people who also have a problem with the unhoused population. So there's a heavy crossover between like a lot of these different aspects of mutual aid and yeah.
I have a small question, and I say that rhetorically and sarcastically because what I'm about to ask is a very, very large question. Can you talk about the confluence of mental health and substance use with the people that you are helping, the people in your collective? You said that there are people in the collective who are themselves unhoused, because so much of the conversation around food insecurity and housing insecurity also touches on mental health and substance use. And I'm curious, again, because you're not a charity, because you're a mutual aid collective, what your take on the confluences of those forces are. Again, a very small, easy to answer question, I know.
I mean, I can take a quick stab at it. Yeah, I mean, I think knowing a lot of folks at Tent City and, just knowing that a lot of people use drugs, we also have a principle of harm reduction as our mutual aid collective, and we distribute harm reduction supplies with the food and everything else. So clean smoke kits, injection kits, naloxone kits, things like this. And yeah, you talk to folks about their substance use, and I think a lot of folks you know, they didn't necessarily use substances or use it to this degree or use, you know, this substance and not that substance until they found themselves in the position of houselessness. So, you know, you have these ideas in society where people are unhoused because they use drugs, when really I think a lot of the time it's flipped on its head, that people are using drugs to cope with the minus 20, 30-degree winters and the hot summers and the being treated as subhuman, et cetera, et cetera. Just the how horrible it is to be outside. Yeah, so there's that, and then it's a lot more difficult to use your substances safely, right? If I'm if I'm housed and I have the means, I can get my drugs tested more easily, perhaps. Maybe I have, you know, more easy access to clean paraphernalia to use my substances, which is, you know, principle of harm reduction is like drugs aren't necessarily the problem. It's the toxic drug crisis, which is created by other forces. It's, you know, the lack of ability to even access drug testing or clean paraphernalia, things like this. Yeah, so there's definitely like overlapping forces there. Yeah, using certain amount of substances is going to make it more difficult to eat, perhaps. Yeah, it's definitely, they feed into each other in sort of like a negative way, I suppose.
And what about the confluence of what you do and who you are in community with and mental health?
Well, I think all humans have a fairly innate need to belong, to be around others, to be understood. Of course, this, you know, varies from individual to individual, how much they need. But like fundamentally, on a neurobiological level, we need to know that we make sense to other people and that other people care about us. And the less we have of that in our life, the more likely we are to turn to addictions or self-harm in one way or another. Also, like people who come from abuse, like whether it's from birth in abusive households or they were in an abusive relationship or any of the number of ways that can happen, there's often not enough support to be held with that trauma. And so trauma like sticks in our bodies. And drugs are one of like humanity's very ancient ways to help get stuff moving, to help us escape from things that we maybe can't physically escape. And yeah, so I think, I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but I feel like the fact that we're people who are going there on a regular basis and are being there with others, like with the folks there as people, is a part of them just like knowing that they're cared about and knowing that they're not forgotten, that yeah, people want them to be here in the world.
I don't know if if your collective has been around long enough to really get a grip on this, but have you noticed anything change over time? Because a lot of my friends who are involved in similar work, you know, their general take is that things have gotten worse over the last couple of years, whether it's more unhoused people, more hungry people, more people struggling with mental illness, more state oppression, this general sense that both emotionally and materially we're on a downward slope. Have you all seen anything like that in your work in Kelowna with the communities that you focus on?
Uh, I'll hop in unless anyone else wants to. I think absolutely we have seen some worsening of situations and circumstances across a whole lot of different ways of life. And those are affecting people who are most marginalized and most vulnerable first. That, of course, includes like Indigenous people, unhoused folks, disabled folks, racialized folks of like all experiences. And we've definitely seen that in Tent City. I know, I think about 6 months into my participation in Solidarity, there was a big jump in the population of Tent City. It went from like it doubled, like very visibly. The stretch that we had to walk was much longer. And there's just a lot more people who are like, even if they themselves are housed, are like, well, I'm choosing between paying rent or buying food for my family. And a lot of that is just driven by capitalism. And a lot of it is also driven by fascism, whether it's people who are open and proud fascists or people who call themselves liberals, but really believe that there are people who are worth less in the world who deserve to be harmed. And yeah, that piles on, like I said, the people who are most marginalized and most vulnerable. So that's why we try to focus our help in that direction.
I wanted to turn the conversation before we wrap up to more of the how, since we've been talking about the why. How do you all get money? How do you all get food? I mean, how do you amass the resources that you use to help people in Solidarity? Shout out to Camus for helping, and shout out to you all for applying for our inaugural micro grant program. But I'm sure that doesn't come close to covering your needs. So can you tell us a little bit more about the how you gather resources?
As far as I know, we have a Patreon, and we get donations. I think, I don't know, at least 30 or so donors every month, if I can remember correctly, give or take. And then sometimes we just get donations just from individuals. I'm sure we all pull on any resources we have in our lives to see if we can, find people to donate. Certain businesses, I don't know if I'm allowed to say, but give us money on occasion. Yeah, I don't know. I'm probably missing a few things, but if anyone has anything to add.
And Mo, where can people find your Patreon? Do you have that? Do you have that available? If not, I can give you a shout out. It's Patreon is Solidarity Sundays, I think. If you just look it up on the Patreon website. So, do you see Solidarity Sundays, and please don't feel any pressure to answer yes. If the answer is no, that is perfectly okay. Do you see Solidarity Sundays as maybe the first step in a larger political project? Is this going to be taken anywhere in addition to community support, or is your focus mainly on community support, helping the hungry and the unhoused?
I think I see Solidarity Sundays playing a pretty key role in our community for, the building of social movements towards things other than even just food security, things like housing, things, beyond that. Yeah, in addition to the weekly food distribution and such that we do, we also run like a bi-weekly discussion group. For the longest time, it was just after our distro on Sundays. Pretty much everybody, whoever was down, would go to somebody's house, and we would, somebody would lead a discussion group, and it was usually on some kind of a socio-political topic. So we'd watch a documentary about the housing crisis, or talk about the toxic drug crisis, or any number of topics. Yeah, so like there's definitely a strong educational component to the collective, building people's abilities to make sense of what we're seeing in real time. It's sort of this beautiful relationship between theory and practice, where like we're out there doing the stuff, doing the direct action, feeding people, talking to folks, seeing, the oppression that bylaw and RCMP use towards unhoused people. And then we're also, afterwards discussing it, making sense of it together and drawing on theory and stuff. Yeah, so I think I see it as educational and as a place to like base build, to get more folks involved, people who are themselves marginalized and oppressed, coming into the collective, starting to realize their sort of class consciousness ever more so, and then have that be a ground to work on future fights that maybe go beyond going to Tent City and feeding people.
And I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about your sweet relief projects, which I think is sweet both figuratively and metaphorically. If you could maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I can talk about that quick. Yeah, I mean, Kelowna summers have gotten hotter and hotter every year. And I think that like us applying for the grant was to, further our ability to offer summer heat mitigation stuff. So I think the money right now has been going towards, we're giving everybody at Tent City at least once a week an ice cream and a frozen lemonade. And that's, there's almost 200 folks there. Yeah, so it's sweet because it's great ice cream and iced tea, I think it is. And yeah, it's a relief from the heat, most definitely. We've been trying to give out the frozen iced teas in the morning with clothing distribution, I believe, before the heat wave, and then the ice cream's coming around 6 or 7 p.m.
I think that's so fantastic because, again, going off of my experience in the US, I don't know if this is the same in Canada, but so many people, even in the, as you said, the the nonprofit industrial complex, so many people are of the belief that community aid is good as long as it's not too extravagant, right? Like community aid is good if we're talking about rice and beans and bread and water. But once we start talking about giving people just the smallest amount of luxuries, whether it's a cold ice cream or a cold iced tea, all of a sudden we are doing something that's unjustifiable, or we're rewarding people somehow for the supposedly negative choices they've made in their lives that have brought them to, housing insecurity or food insecurity. I was hoping if maybe you could touch a little bit on that, if you've heard anything like that or heard any backlash, or if you think Canada has the same sort of condemnatory judgmentalism that I found in the States previously.
Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit. Just a couple weeks ago, I believe they actually took down. They had a garden going on there, and were growing like a ton of stuff, and they took it down. Part of the reason they like the city bylaw and like whatever took it down, and part of the reason they did that was to like disincentivize people from having like basic comforts and their needs met at there essentially, and just sort of like make it more appealing, and that was sort of like their way of like diminishing that.
So the unhoused people at Tent City were trying to build a garden, and bylaws came and destroyed it.
Yeah, they had like full tall stalks of corn growing and all that, like lots of food, and it's all gone now. I don't know what happened to it. I know that they tried to salvage as much as they could while it was being destroyed, but yeah, that was just a couple weeks ago.
And did they make a statement, or did they say why, or were they just following orders like so many great heroes of the past?
I think part of it was in the news reports was a sort of accessibility for emergencies, but also it was stated that it was to sort of like make it less attractive for people to live there essentially.
That's really interesting and very tragic. Oak, you looked like you had something to add as well.
Yeah, I like the destruction of the garden is something that pains me very deeply, and just the concept that, oh, like if there's any sort of comfort, then we're encouraging people to like not live up to their potential, or whatever weird horrific phrasing is used. But like the fact of the matter is, like, people need to feel cared for, and like absolutely having the absolute basics covered is important, but so is just being treated as a person, and having joys is an important part of healing and growth. and like the real, I want to, I feel like we're all on the same page here, but I want to say it explicitly. No one who is unhoused is there because they have made bad decisions. They are there because this society is geared towards punishing people for being people. And so to be on the other side of that, to be like, no, people, like, the ice cream brightens people's day and it makes them feel like, you know, they as people, like, that we want them to be happy as well as well fed. And I know one other thing that we've done sometimes is give out cigarettes. And that's something that there has been pushback from some people about, of like,
Who did you, sorry to interrupt you, Oak, but who did you get pushback from? Not their name, but in the collective, outside the collective?
I believe there was some just like discussion of whether we should be open about that's something that we do, because some people were like, I believe some people were looking at giving us money, but then weren't comfortable because we openly stated that we gave out cigarettes sometimes. I was there for like the discussions after, but not the initial comments, if that makes sense. But the same thing, it's like, for people who are having an extremely stressful day and for whom smoking is a part of their life, having someone just be like, oh, like, either here's a cigarette or here's a pack, is a, like, it's a big relief, and it's something that gives them comfort and is something that meets them on their own terms, which I think is also a very important part of mutual aid, like not deciding for people what is good for them, but asking them, what do you need? And taking them at their word for it and then providing it as best you can.
Yeah, I love it when people who preach the hardest about not rewarding quote unquote bad choices and not providing comforts to people who are on the margins of society because it somehow rewards them, then go home and have a drink at the end of a stressful day. Like, I love the hypocrisy of that. I think that's fantastic. I think, yeah, providing obviously food and clothing, but also ice cream and even cigarettes, anything to help make people's lives easier in a non-judgmental way, I just think is wonderful. I mean, to me, that goes to really the core of what it means to be a collective that's pursuing mutual aid. And I'm just full of admiration for all of you and for your group. You all have done some really amazing things. Any final thoughts on Solidarity Sundays? Any final thoughts on organizing mutual aid in Kelowna? Anything you want to share with our audience before we go?
I mean, one thing that comes to mind is, like, the four of us were chatting before we hopped on, about like just how, you go back a couple of years and we were all just, loosely, I can't speak for everyone, but I was loosely interested in leftist politics, didn't really know how to put any of it into practice. And now a couple of years later, we're on a podcast talking about it. Like, if folks out there are listening and, you want to get active, find a friend or two and just start something. You just got to start doing it. Literally just do it, whether it's 5 meals or whether it's just read a text together, and don't be shy to DM us. I think it's solidaritysun@gmail.com, or you can find us on Instagram, solidarity.sundays, I believe. Reach out and we'd be happy to like Zoom call with you and help you develop, your own mutual aid collective. Yeah, it's just super important. Like, the direct action component of it is that, like, it's truly an empowering experience for so many folks that we're not relying on the state or some nonprofit or some alien entity to take care of people. In fact, we're basically premised on the fact that these institutions, nonprofits, charities, the state, are never going to take care of our needs, and they haven't been doing it, and they're not going to. And yeah, there's just something really empowering about getting out there and directly doing it yourself, and what that does not only to the community, but to the people doing the direct action, the transformations that are undergone. And, a couple of years later, you're a part of a big mutual aid collective, and it's a beautiful thing.
I think that's a profound and beautiful sentiment to end on. So Oak and Mo and Neiman and Sasha, thank you so much for joining us For those of you listening, please show your support. You can find Solidarity Sundays on Patreon. You can also find them on Instagram. And I just really appreciate you all taking the time and sharing your space and your thoughts and your labors with me and with our audience today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Joel. It's great to have you here.
Great to talk to you.
Jesus Christ came back today like you threatened he will. Which poor group of people do you think that he would kill? And who would Jesus choose to starve if you gave him the chance? And if there was a genocide, would he take a neutral stance? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would he say it's complicated and there's sinners on both sides? Or would he say that some people, they just deserve to die? If Jesus Christ rose from the dead and on a sidewalk slept, would you extend your hand to him or just watch where you stepped? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus hate the gay folk, the queer folk, or the trans? Would he suggest they end their lives according to God's plans? Would Jesus tell a homeless man to get a fucking job, or turn his back on the poor? Would Jesus be a snob? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus build a border wall? Would Jesus drive a tank? Would Jesus be a landlord? Would Jesus run a bank? Would Jesus Christ feel safe in his skin if he came to your town? And would you still believe in him if you found out he was brown? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Yeah, who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well,